The date is May 21st, 2026, and the backcountry corridor flanking Highway 93A north of Jasper, Alberta looks, from a distance, like nothing much is happening. The snow line has retreated to the high shoulders of the Front Ranges, but in the valley, spring has already moved ahead of the calendar. A wet winter and an early thaw have pushed the boreal understory weeks forward. Willows and alder have surged out from the drainage margins and the slope breaks, filling the gaps between the spruce stands with walls of green. Along the maintenance corridors that thread through this terrain, the sightlines that gave walkers a sense of what lay ahead have been replaced by vegetation that stops the eye at 10 feet, sometimes less. The corridor looks like a landscape at rest. It is not. A trail crew worker set out that morning on an assignment that, on paper, was routine. His mandate was the kind of work that happens every spring across hundreds of kilometers of managed backcountry before the public ever arrives. Clearing deadfall that the winter's weight had dropped across the trail surface, inspecting drainage infrastructure for damage from snowmelt runoff, opening routes that had been closed since the fall. This particular stretch feeds into Parks Canada's network of backcountry access routes, trails that will carry hikers, horseback riders, and cyclists through the summer months once the season formally opens. Before that happens, someone has to walk them first. This year, on this stretch, that someone was him. He was working alone. That detail is not unusual. Solo assignments are standard practice for spring trail maintenance operations in this region, a practical reality shaped by the scale of the terrain that needs to be covered and the relatively predictable nature of the work. Men and women go out alone every spring across this country into corridors exactly like this one. Most days, nothing happens. The risk is accepted as background noise, a condition of the job rather than a feature of it. But before we get to the investigation findings, if this kind of detailed case analysis is what you're here for, the like button and subscribe are right there. This channel covers these incidents the way they deserve. No sensationalism, just the forensics, the environmental context, and the hard questions about what went wrong. If that's worth something to you, it takes about 2 seconds. Anyway, back to what the track castings and hair samples revealed about the bear's movements in the 48 hours prior. But late May in the Jasper region is not a neutral time to be in the low-elevation corridors. Grizzly bears emerge from winter denning underweight, carrying a caloric deficit that drives them into precisely the terrain where maintenance routes run. The dandelion flats along the valley floor, the root systems exposed by freshets along drainage channels, the early ungulate carcasses left by winter. All of it concentrates bears in the brushy low country during this narrow seasonal window. Wildlife biologists call it the high-calorie forage period. In the Jasper corridor, which holds one of the densest grizzly populations in Alberta, it means the bears are moving through thick cover in numbers, and they are moving with purpose. The vegetation compounds that risk in a way that is easy to understate. Bear safety protocols, the guidance that governs what workers and hikers are supposed to do when they encounter a grizzly, are built around the assumption of reaction distance. The logic is simple. If you see a bear at sufficient range, you have options. You can alter your path. You can make yourself known. You can give the animal room to register your presence and choose to avoid you. But the willows and alder that a wet spring has pushed across this corridor do not leave that distance. They compress the space between a person and what is moving on the other side of them to almost nothing. The protocols were not written for this vegetation. They were written for a different trail. And beyond all of that, there is the matter of the terrain buffer, the sheer remoteness of where he was working, the distance from any rapid response, the fact that no one was working beside him. If something happened, the mechanism that would surface it was an absence, a missed check-in, a silence, a truck that didn't move. He moves into the corridor on the morning of May 21st with every risk factor already in place. The brush closes behind him. This is where the morning stops being routine. The brush is close on both sides. He is moving through it the way maintenance workers do, attention on the route, on deadfall, on the drainage markers that need checking before the summer hikers arrive. There is no warning, no extended approach through the vegetation. The bear is simply not there. And then it is. What wildlife forensics identifies as the most dangerous category of grizzly encounter is precisely this: sudden emergence at close range from heavy cover. Not a stalk, not a prolonged pursuit that gives the human time to register a threat and respond. A near-zero reaction window. The encounter is already underway before the brain has processed the stimulus. At the distances that dense spring brush creates, that window can be measured in fractions of a second. It is, in every documented sense, the worst configuration. Understanding why the bear is in this corridor at all requires understanding what late May means to a grizzly in the Jasper region. By this point in the year, these animals are in what wildlife biologists describe as a hyperphagia-adjacent state, not yet the extreme caloric loading of pre-denning autumn, but a sustained, aggressive drive to exploit every available food source after months of torpor. The body is rebuilding. The movement is purposeful and intense. The low-elevation terrain is where that movement concentrates. Dandelion flats spread across the valley bottoms and open margins, offering dense, digestible carbohydrate. Root systems, sedge, horsetail, the bulbs and rhizomes that push up through the damp spring soil, are being systematically excavated. And in late May, ungulate carcasses left by winter are still present in the landscape. Elk and deer that did not survive the cold months, their remains now accessible as the snow continues to pull back. These resources cluster along the same low-elevation corridors that the maintenance routes travel. The worker and the bear are in the same terrain for entirely different reasons, following entirely different schedules. The nature of what happens next is, in the analysis that follows, almost certainly a defensive contact. A surprised grizzly at near-zero distance, with no warning space, no retreat possible on either side, no preceding signal from the human that could have altered the trajectory, reacts to protect its immediate space. This is not a predatory sequence. There is no pursuit, no extended engagement characteristic of a bear that has identified a human as prey. What the evidence will later indicate is a single, rapid, violent contact. The reflex of an animal startled at close range, expressing the only response that instinct provides. The attack is fatal, and when it ends, there is silence. He has no partner with him. That is the operating condition. One worker, alone, in a remote corridor. There is no one to intervene in the seconds that matter. There is no one to call for help in the aftermath. No one to trigger an alert from the scene. The silence that follows the contact is total and immediate. The first signal that something is wrong comes later, not from the corridor itself, but from the absence of a transmission. A missed check-in at the designated interval activates the search protocol. The silence is the message. Teams are dispatched into the area, moving through the same dense spring brush that defined the encounter, and the worker is recovered later that day within the corridor. He is found where the evidence says the contact occurred. What that site shows is consistent with everything environmental forensics predicts for this encounter typology. Track evidence, the positioning of the scene, the nature and distribution of the injuries, all of it points to a short, violent contact event. A single, rapid, defensive encounter. Not a sustained attack. Not a predatory sequence that unfolded over distance or time. A sudden, close, overwhelming contact, and then it was over. Alberta Fish and Wildlife officers and Parks Canada move quickly. The trail corridor is locked down. Access is suspended. A formal investigation is opened, and the work of reconstructing exactly what happened and identifying the animal responsible begins. The corridor is locked. The evidence is in place. Within 48 hours, investigators will identify the bear. And what they find when they look at the full record of this stretch of the Rockies will be harder to look away from than the attack itself. The investigation moves quickly. Within 48 hours, wildlife officers have identified a grizzly in the area consistent with the attack site evidence. Track castings taken from the soft ground near the scene, hair samples collected from the brush at the point of contact, and proximity data drawn from the regional bear monitoring network that operates across the Jasper corridor. The pieces assemble not as a mystery, but as a confirmation. There is no question about what happened. The question now is the one that outlasts any single incident. What this terrain has been telling the institutions for a very long time. The Jasper corridor holds one of the densest grizzly populations in Alberta. That is not a statistic offered casually. It is the reason a dedicated monitoring network exists here at all. The density of encounters across this landscape, across decades, made a tracking infrastructure not optional, but necessary. The bears are cataloged. Their movement patterns are documented. The pressure they exert on the low-elevation corridors in late spring, when snowmelt pushes forage to the valley floors and every ungulate carcass left by winter becomes a resource worth defending, is understood in precise behavioral terms by the people whose job it is to understand it. Which is what makes the collision documented in the post-incident analysis so difficult to dismiss as an anomaly. Spring trail maintenance schedules open in the same seasonal window as peak grizzly activity at low elevations. This is not coincidence. It is a scheduled intersection, the same one every year, where trail crews move into exactly the corridors that bears are moving through most intensively, under exactly the vegetation conditions that compress sightlines to the width of a few feet. It happens in late May. It has happened in late May for as long as there have been maintenance crews and spring bears, and the encounter record for this stretch of the Canadian Rockies spans decades. Each incident in that record has produced a version of the same conclusion. Late spring, dense brush, and isolation form a specific and recurring threat matrix. The language changes across reports. The conclusion does not. And yet the question that follows every incident, whether the protocols that govern who enters this terrain alone and when and with what equipment, has not been answered with the same consistency that the terrain has posed it. The protocol review that follows this incident focuses, as it must, on the question of solo work assignments in remote backcountry zones during early season operations. It is a reasonable question, and it is not a new one. The practice of sending a single worker into these corridors during the most dangerous overlap of vegetation density and bear activity has been contested before. The argument for it is operational. These routes are long, the work is routine, the crews are experienced. The argument against it is what the ledger shows every time it is opened. There is also a gap that no protocol review can close without first naming it honestly. The protocols governing remote trail maintenance were not designed for the vegetation that a wet spring produces. They were not calibrated to the behavioral window that late May creates for grizzlies moving aggressively through low-elevation corridors in search of food. A wet spring changes the density of the willows. It does not change the date the maintenance schedule begins. What happened on May 21, 2026 is not a verdict on the worker. He went into the corridor because that was his job, and he did it without deviation from any expectation placed on him. It is not a verdict on the bear, which emerged from heavy cover and responded according to its nature in a close-distance surprise encounter. What it is, what the evidence, the incident record, and the post-analysis combine to produce is a reckoning with the specific conditions this terrain generates every spring, and with the institutional decisions that continue to determine who enters those conditions alone. The ledger does not close, it accumulates. Another entry, another May, another point in a record that stretches back through this landscape with a consistency that patience should not be confused with acceptance. The knowledge is there. It has been there. What follows this incident, what follows every incident added to this record, is a question that belongs not to the terrain, but to the people who set the terms for entering it. The routes along the Jasper corridor will open to summer hikers in the weeks ahead. The willows will continue to grow. The snow will finish its retreat to the high country, and the corridor will look, to anyone moving through it for the first time, like something peaceful, something manageable. The bears will still be in the brush.